can. Over to you, Sasha. Welcome.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Really appreciate that. And thanks everybody for dialing in to the session this afternoon. And it's always a little bit daunting when somebody reads your bio, because I, like everyone else on the planet, get stuck by a kind of huge imposter syndrome scenario kicking in. So just a couple of things before we jump into the topic. I've got a background in psychology, but for the first part of my career, I worked in finance. So I worked in London for several investment banks. I sat on the trading room floor and I sold derivatives to clients. So I've always come at the topic, or to the topic, of diversity and inclusion from a very commercial angle, as well as the ethics behind it. And that'll probably become pretty obvious in this webinar. Also, very much from an HR perspective, the reason that 20 years ago I then left banking and reinvented myself into a diversity consultant was because I felt there was a niche, a gap in the market to raise awareness around people and around behavior. I'm sure that pretty much everyone on this call will have experiences similar to mine, in that when I looked at the trading room floor of the bank I was working in, I asked myself, there were 650 people in that room, big trading room floor, how many of these people are managers? And the answer was probably about 30%. And then I asked myself the question, why? Why did those people get promoted into a senior role? Why some and not others? And the answer, and this is going back 20 years, was really basic, that people in finance got promoted because they were intrinsically good at what they do. And at that time, that meant making money. And being good at what you do, your underlying job, does not necessarily mean at all you come automatically equipped with all the skills needed to promote diversity and promote an inclusive culture and behave as an inclusive leader. And we've got 33 people on this call, and again, for you to reflect really on, do I see that? What's the leadership capability where I am? Where are the people risks? Why do people get promoted? How much do they know about inclusion and diversity? And so when we first started planning this event today in terms of the topic, I felt that it was really, really important that we should be focusing on, right, 2021, inclusion and diversity, how important is that in a hybrid work environment? And what does that mean to behaviors, and where do we go from here? And so that is very much the backdrop to the session. What do we mean by inclusion and diversity? Is it more or less important now? And what is ahead in the next 12 years? So in the last 20 years that I've been doing this, we've worked cross-sector with small organizations and with large organizations in 24 countries. Sector-wise, media, technology, law, finance, sport, arts, biosciences, manufacturing, all sorts of different businesses. And again, the kind of issues and challenges that we're hearing from people across the UK, and much broader than that, are really about leadership capability, management capability on diversity and inclusion, and also overwhelm. Where do I start? Who do I start with? Where do I go? Whose responsibility is this? What's the language around inclusion? What is that alphabet soup that is LGBTQ plus, etc.? There's fear. There's a lot of fear around this subject. And there's a lot more fear now than there was 18 months ago. And so, this short hour today is your hour. No one is expected to be a subject matter expert in this. But if you've got questions or points or insights or anything, we would like you to share those in the chat. or if you've got specific questions, we'll pick them up at the end. But it would be very useful to know the sorts of topics that you're also interested in over and above what we've got here. But I'm also going to ask you a few questions, and we'll use the chat for that. So if you're sitting there munching away on your lunch, great, but could you also answer this question? So when you think about diversity in the context of your work environment, what things come to mind? So in the chat, so I'm going to try and make this interactive. When you think diversity, what comes to mind in your business around diversity? What do you think of when you think diversity? What diversity are you looking at, attaining for? What does it mean to you? So we're talking here about fairness, fabulous, bringing one's full self to work, a sense of belonging. Thank you, Abby. Fidelis is also saying it's about belonging. Great. A wide group of people in the business as possible, says Sharon. Love that. Think I know you, Sharon. Inclusion and equity. Great. Creating a universal framework. I love that. It's about respects, says Seema. Voice, even, especially when that voice challenges status quo. Absolutely. And Laura Simpson, I see you. I think that is really important about, do we feel safe to challenge what's done around here? It's about bringing something different to the table and dealing with institutional failures. I love that. That's really interesting. Hi, Emily. Nice to see you here. It's about representation across the business. Absolutely. Terry says seeing the world through a different perspective, and that's absolutely it. And it's how broad is my perspective? How inclusive is my lens? If I'm in an HR function or a business function, how am I treating people? Is everyone getting equitable treatment? Diversity of experience. It's valuing people, says Justine. It's about being perceived. Oh, Kate says, see it as box ticking. Now that's very interesting, Kate, Gregory. When you say they see it as box ticking, Kate, are you talking about externally or internal leadership? Is it seen as quotas, positive discrimination, broader diversity? I'm very interested, Kate, if you can. Yeah, got it. Okay, internal leadership. Right. Interesting. You should say that. I think that quite often at a very strategic level, like Exco or board, there is a conceptual, I get this, but when it hits the permafrost of the management level underneath it, there's a massive lack of action because of positive discrimination or quotas or lowering the bar or all of those prejudices around it. Ben says something fascinating here. For my organizations, we're focusing on belonging and increasing the amount of underrepresented groups in leadership roles. Brilliant. Brilliant. Well, Terry, absolutely. We don't want people to see it as box ticking. And that's one of the biggest challenges. How do I motivate for change around diversity? And so challenging mindsets about what diversity is and isn't is really critical. And I'm going to start with that. I'm going to start with, when we think about diversity, what do we think about? And it's very easy from a UK-centric perspective, or wherever one is, but particularly from a UK-centric perspective, to focus on gender and race when we're talking about diversity in the workplace. And gender and race are really, really, really important. Obviously, we know that. They're also pretty visible. And we have pay gap reporting on gender and around the corner on ethnicity. And that, I'm not saying these are not important, but I'm saying let's think broadly about diversity. Let's think broadly, and let's think about the intersectionality. So using the iceberg as a metaphor for diversity, of course, we have gender there, it's visible, and we have race, skin color, etc. But look underneath this waterline of how nuanced and subtle elements of who we are as human beings are in terms of visual portraying it, right? Neurodiversity, that's there, absolutely. It's just underneath the waterline of visibility. We have our education. So where people were educated, where they've worked before, does that influence your recruiting strategy or the line's recruiting strategy? Probably. Life experiences, everything that's happened to me in the 54 years I've been on the planet more or less is going to impact how I am today, how I see the world, how I treat my team, how I engage with my clients, and how I engage as a human being. So our past experiences are really important. Our values and our beliefs are really, really critical, because those are the elements of this is okay around here or this isn't okay around here, around banter, around behavior, etc. So I really quite like what a couple of people were saying. I'm just going down the chat about belonging and culture, and voice, because belonging, culture, voice, who I am, how I feel around here is all about inclusion. And I think that when you're thinking about diversity, it helps to think very broad about it and recognize its fluidity. If we're thinking this is just about broader representation at senior exec levels, we're missing a trick, because diversity is about you and about me, that every human on the planet is unique, so we're all diverse. And when you're trying to take people along with you on this journey at work for cultural transformation, one of my best pieces of advice is meet people where they're at. Okay, meet people where they're at and recognize people are going to be motivated by different things. People are going to be motivated by different things in terms of what's important to them. Before we go to the next slide, I also want you to think about who I am. So on the right-hand side of the iceberg, you've got role and function. I really impress this when we do facilitation for exco and board and leaders, to say, I don't think you've probably ever thought that diversity is about who you are within your organization. But your role, your status, your title, your network, your age, and your seniority is going to affect how you treat people and how people behave around you. And that is a diversity challenge. And when we started doing this session today, we placed it in the context of a hybrid working environment. And this is one of the most fundamental issues that leadership needs to get their head around now. How do I lead and manage diversity in an inclusive way when some people will be working at home, some people will be coming into the office, some sense of flexibility, some people may never want to come back? And what does that do to my priorities? And what does that do to my leadership capability? And again, my original point is that most people get promoted because they're good at their job, not because they're particularly good at being leaders. So it's a capability that needs to be developed. And what good diversity is, good diversity and inclusion awareness, is really just good leadership with an inclusion lens. So getting back to meeting people where they're at, let's have a look at the why behind this. Why is it important? So, just doing some analysis on our side. It's important to your future talent acquisition. It's important to your future talent acquisition, of course. It's also important, as you can see, for many other reasons. Inclusion, there's a business driver behind it. Organizations with inclusive cultures are more likely to meet or exceed financial targets. People decide what their products they're going to buy based on organizational values, what a brand represents, and they put their money there or don't. Female led companies, according to Standard & Poor's, again, 3 times the returns on the S&P index. Generationally, we can cut this and look at different generations saying this is important. To me, one of the big changes was really recent, actually, when Glassdoor started to have a diversity metric on their dashboard, because 70% of job seekers use diversity as an important factor when considering company and job offers. So look, let's just assume that the ethics behind this are a given, right? This is the right thing to do. This is also about winning business, product development, marketing, talent acquisition, and really critically, stakeholder investment and that whole supply chain. So you could wrap inclusion and diversity around everything. It's important to who you hire today, tomorrow, next year. It's about how you develop your people, and it's about how a brand or an organization is authentically represented in the market. So if people think, oh, diversity is going to go off the radar, I just honestly don't think anyone could be more wrong. So when you think about diversity, I think it's useful to to recognize diversity is about being a human being. Okay, it's about you and it's about me, and I think that's really, really key. It's about how we think. It's about what influences the way we see our world, and it's utterly about representation. And for many organizations, it's about metrics. What do we look like? What's our demography? Are we representative of Birmingham or York or London or New York or whatever? So there's obviously work in progress. But diversity is very different from inclusion. And the two words are put together as if they're interchangeable, as if they're one and the same. Absolutely not. So we've worked with over 1 million people in the last 20 years. A lot of the organizations we work with are quite conservative, banks, law firms, etc. That means that they tend to have relatively low diversity, but high inclusion. That's easy because everyone's like me. Where it becomes much more challenging, and for you to self-reflect on your own business, is when organizations have higher diversity, what happens to inclusion? Because inclusion is culture, it's belonging, it's what does it feel like for me around here? It's a sense of, do I feel I belong? So a lot of you were putting belonging, and that's brilliant, you've nailed it. Inclusion is about having a culture where I can be me. So authenticity is really important. I don't have to go to work and hide an element of who I am. I can go to work and do my best be my best self, because I'm not anxious about covering something. And now I know about that in terms of LGBT as a gay woman. Very, very interesting how many students go back in the closet when they leave university, having been out at university. And according to Stonewall, who work extensively within the LGBT community, that has about a 30% impact on the bottom line around productivity, hiding an element of who you are, self-editing, not feeling safe. So, there's a huge argument why it helps to allow people to be themselves. There's also, interestingly, a huge link between that and mental health and anxiety. And clearly, as we hopefully come out of the pandemic, mental health is, I'm sure, on the top of many organizations on this call in terms of strategy and what we're thinking about. And mental health and diversity and inclusion are all part of the same conversation. But I just really want to make the point that inclusion is owned by you and it's owned by me, because there is a choice about inclusion all the time. Any human contact we have, be it on Zoom, Teams, face-to-face, we have a choice about inclusion. It's behavioral, it's a verb, it's a doing word. But most humans on this planet are inclusive with people like them. That is easy. What I'd like you to be thinking about is, in my business, do people know what inclusion looks like? Just getting quite a lot of kickback. It sounds like someone's eating something with a spoon. If you're not on mute, do you think you could go on mute, please? It's making me feel hungry. Thank you. So inclusion is definitely what I think should be front and center of the conversation as we move forward. And let's look at the benefits. So apart from it's the right thing to do, when I've worked with organizations that really have done well on diversity, they've put inclusion front and center of strategy. So I would always say put the I before the D. Because when we get an inclusive culture right, and that's constant work, you get these kinds of results. And as a consequence, it's easier to attract people from underrepresented groups. And when people do turn up, they stay and they do their best work. So inclusion for me is like glue. It's that kind of secret sauce. And how do you create an inclusive culture? Well, I'll come back to you on how you create an inclusive culture. And actually, I'm just going to ask you. So how do you as organizations, because we've got 35 people, or just as individuals, what are the ingredients for inclusion? Just a quick question there. What do you think is needed to create an inclusive culture? Just put that in the chat. Really looking forward to ideas on that. As we see the benefits, but what do you need for it? Voice, says Terry. Voice across different platforms. Yeah, and Terry, I would say intersectionality there as well, yeah? We need education, says Claire Sharp. Education. The why. What's in it for me? Laura, absolutely. We need clarity about what good behavior looks like and what's accepted, and accountability. I absolutely agree with you, Laura. I think that's one of the most key ingredients. What does good look like? And bad behavior is not swept under the carpet. Curiosity, acceptance, feeling I won't be fired for speaking up. Beautiful. Employee resource groups, yeah. Representations of different voices. And I would say you can have ERGs, but if they're not listened to, that's a waste of time. Okay, we need good leaders. I agree, Justine. And that those leaders need to be authentic and they need to be allies. We need safety, Abby says, a safe environment. And I would passionately advocate psychological safety as inextricably linked to an inclusive culture. Role modeling by senior management. So Carla, to have those role models, people need to know what good looks like. Absolutely right. We need supportive, clear guidelines. So Fidelis, that's about policy. And as I'm sure you're aware, it's easier to debias policy than it is a person. So process, policy, strip the bias out of that. High psychological safety, says Kate. Leadership, buy-in. And Jazz, that leadership needs to get what inclusion looks like behaviorally. Okay, fabulous. So everyone's on the absolutely the right page there around what this looks like. And I'm just going to jump ahead because there's a slide I want to share with you because it really it plays to this in terms of what the ingredients are. So McKinsey's has done a lot of work on inclusion and diversity, and I love this. It's published probably a year ago, and I think it's super helpful. What companies need, small and big, large and small, is a systemic. So it's built into our systems. It's the foundations. It's the bricks in the mortar, a business-led approach. If this sits with HR and no one else, it's not okay. Increasingly, you will see inclusion and diversity positions being a boardroom seat. That's what we're seeing in the States. That's definitely what we're increasingly going to see in the UK. It's a seat at the board. It's not an HR. It's not a side of desk. It's not enthusiastic amateurs. It's held and valued by the business for all of the reasons that I've shared around brand, around reputation, around talent acquisition, around who buys the products, around things like ESG, value proposition, everything. There should be a commitment to increase diverse representation. There should be strengthened leadership accountability for delivery on goals. So again, business managers making their own business plans on delivery and being accountable for that in their teams, in their wider groups. It's about enabling equality of opportunity through fairness and transparency, promoting openness and tackling bias, and fostering belonging through multivariate diversity support. And I think this is very, very helpful as an overview. I really, really do. So let's just go back to why now and why is it important now? And it's very easy to collate the rationale behind why now. And there's a few things I just want to go into in a bit more depth. And one of those is COVID. And there's been so much evidence now printed in the last year, published, and I'm sure everyone on the call is aware that the pandemic is disproportionately impacting different groups adversely, particularly people from the BAME community, people of colour, working mothers, social mobility, that kind of digital divide between have and have not, different age groups, obviously. So yes, same storm, but absolutely different boats. And some of those boats have got whacking great holes in them. So from a workplace perspective, what's out there is obviously in your workplace. So different communities have been really adversely impacted. So what we've seen is diversity has fallen off the radar often for managers as well, because it links to the biases that we have. So not only is there that pandemic, then if you go back 2018, 2017, and the Me Too and Time's Up. So for the first time, there was a kind of global movement around calling out poor behavior. Started in Hollywood with Weinstein and ricocheted around the world. And of course, ricocheted into workplaces. So many sectors, banking, finance, law, manufacturing, all sorts of different sectors are having or have had or are in the midst of their Me Too moments, where voices call out unacceptable behavior. And it's wise to see that with a very wide lens, not just, oh, that's sexual harassment, because it's much broader than that. But recently, the murder of Sarah Everard has brought again women's voices around fear, around violence, around domestic violence, around safety to come to the fore. And of course, that's going to is impacting on workplace dynamics and politics. And calling out behaviors requires a safe environment. So again, why is this important? It's important to reflect on how safe does it feel to work around here? How safe is it to have a voice, to call out inappropriate behavior? And if I do, what happens? We also have the hybrid environment, hence the character in pajamas and a suit, with the added cat for authenticity. You know, how are we now going to work? And this is really important, because I believe that many organizations are sort of sleepwalking into this, and working out what the new workplace looks like is sort of iterating week by week. We've seen a big increase of workplaces listening more, sentiment analysis, questionnaires, etc. But I think there is a bias towards rushing back into a workplace with an assumption that that's probably what everyone's going to want, and that's absolutely not what everyone's going to want. Some people have utterly thrived. Some people have really found more of a balance and maybe relooked the way in which they want to run their life. And if workplaces are just very linear about this is what this looks like, we're going to miss out on optimizing people's talent and miss out on that whole engagement and productivity piece. So my advice there would be definitely be listening to the different voices within your organization about how people want to work, where they want to work, and what that looks like. But I'd also say this really links with bias as well. It really, really links with bias, and the bias of the line, the manager and senior leadership team around how we want to work in a hybrid environment. Is there a swing one way or the other? And are we taking everyone along with us? There's never been a more important need to listen to people and to recognize there's never going to be a one size fits all. And you can see there that Black Lives Matter is also very much an important part of consideration for workplace diversity issues. So Black Lives Matter and the murder of George Floyd, which I think the trial is coming to an end today, has probably the most seminal move in terms of understanding racial injustice, structural racism and discrimination that I've seen in my lifetime, and absolutely has affected the corporate narrative and what organizations do to respond to that. What I really, really strongly feel is there's been some good that's come out of this in terms of better listening to Black voices and Black lived experiences. That then in turn can lead to better listening to employee experiences from different different demographies. But if organizations don't follow through in addressing racism, then they will be called out for it. And I think that that is a very important thing to be mindful of, authenticity. Because across the world, organizations tended to respond to Black Lives Matter, blacking out Instagram feeds, corporate narrative, reflecting on this, we need to do better. But if we don't see action over the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to lose talent, or people are not going to want to work in those organizations in the first place. So when we look ahead, because a part of the mandate today was what's ahead, I think it's worth being mindful of authenticity on delivering around racism and structural discrimination is really critical. So easier to strip bias out of process than is people. What are you doing around mindsets? Mental health, obviously wellness, number one priority. And I think that wellness conversation is also inextricably linked with the inclusion and diversity conversation. This is now a strategic imperative in many boardrooms. It's not, the HR function. It's not a nice to have. It's a strategic imperative. And we see this in businesses around procurement all the time. Professional services, but whether they be accountants, law firms, banks, in order to win new mandates, both public and private sector have to demonstrate that they have policies around inclusion and diversity. But increasingly, it's not box ticking. It's evidence-based. What do you do that shows that you're supportive of minorities within your workplace? What do your policies look like? How many claims have you had? What are you doing that shows people live the values? The conversations are becoming much more sophisticated around accountability. And at the end of the day, as I said before, if organizations can put culture and inclusion at front and center of the strategy, that's a great place to start. See inclusion as the beating heart of any diversity strategy. But so, with the pandemic, etc., psychological safety is going to be part of going forward on this. Psychological safety is having a renaissance at the moment. A lot of work on psychological safety have been done over the years by Amy Edmondson from Harvard. It's a condition in which people feel included, safe to learn, safe to contribute, and safe to challenge the status quo without being fearful of being humiliated or embarrassed. So a lot of the good work we see organizations doing now, as we come out of pandemic, is how do we create a culture of psychological safety? Do leaders and managers know how to do that? How good are we at listening? I think humans generally have a superiority illusion. They're really good listeners, but not so much when you ask the people around them. So again, how do we educate people to listen better? Active listening. Recognizing that different generations will have a different language around inclusion and diversity, see workplaces in different ways. This is why there's such a resurgence now, or what we're seeing as a business, of reverse mentoring. What can we learn from each other? Psychological safety is really critical. And if we don't have it in our organizations, we cannot but hope to be inclusive. So education around that is key. But also bias. And I know somebody, and I haven't been able to drill down because I'm focusing on what I'm saying, somebody brought up unconscious bias. Unconscious bias is just a reality. It's about being a human. If you're a human, you're going to be riddled with bias. We have at least 150 biases on the go at any one time. So anyone that thought it's not me, you're in the wrong room. And I'm thinking, because I'm predominantly, I think, speaking to HR people, you get that and you know it. Now, I'm the first to admit there's a lot of bad press about the effectiveness of unconscious bias training. What I would say, and having been in this game for 20 years, is I think there's very much a need to increase our preferences and how we see the world. It's never going to be the golden bullet that is going to solve diversity issues. It should be part of inclusion capability building. Can't miss it out. but it has to be done well. And the problem is there are a lot of suppliers out there in this space. It's an unregulated industry, and as a consequence, it's easy to put people back if you don't have good people doing the stuff. So bias can come out everywhere. And I just like in the chat, over and above what we've shared here around biases, preferences, that can come in who we select, therefore who we develop, who gets promoted, what kind of feedback we give people, how we reward. What other ideas are there around where bias could hit your culture? So just put your answers in the chat. I'm just really interested to find out where people are coming from on that. Where else do we see biases in our organizations? Anyone want to share any ideas of where they see bias just by writing that in the chat? Engagement and events. Abby, that's an interesting one. Yeah, the thing about events, Abby, that I always see is what time is the event? What type is the event? And is it subconsciously exclusionary through its time and type? Clients might not be with us on this. That's right, Terry. Yeah, exactly. And Terry, again, playing devil's advocate, do we have a responsibility to partner with our clients on this, to educate our clients? Is that not our role? Again, I don't have all the answers here, but what I do notice is if I'm a supplier, the people I'm supplying my supplies to are often in the same place of ambiguity and don't know what to do around inclusion and diversity, because that for me means maybe opportunity to partner on this. Procurement bias, yep. Who we choose for projects, absolutely, Sharon. And Sharon, I think that expediency bias, I want to get stuff done, means my default is always to go, right, you can have that and you can have that and you can have that, because I know you as a team do a brilliant job. And I have to counsel myself and slow down in who I'm not giving out our work to, because we're human. Okay, nice one here from Fidelis. In addition to the above comments, new to the business colleagues versus colleagues who've been there a long time. Absolutely. And how people get treated. And also, Fidelis, the language around people. So it might be that there's a legacy language. We talk about this, we do this. And if I'm new and I've onboarded in COVID, I wouldn't have a clue what people are talking about. And I'll immediately feel I don't belong around here. Yes. So a lot to unpack there. A bias in tech can be baked in and people can feel data can't be biased. Absolutely. And Sharon, I know you know more about it than I do, but just from a coding perspective, if predominantly coders are male, what's that going to do in terms of AI, etc.? So bias is everywhere and it's pervasive. But again, I would maintain, third time of seeing it, it's a lot easier to take bias out of a process, i.e. blind recruitment, than it is a person. And just have a look at this wonderful image here of I hire people who are like me, the affinity bias that we all have because we're human. I like people who are like me, the mirror image. And this is for us all to be mindful of. What does this look like for us in our business? Who is involved in discussions about recruitment in your business? What communication styles are favored? Do we have a premium on people of extroverts versus introverts? And what's that doing to our talent acquisition and who gets heard in meetings? Do people know the connection between what we think and how we behave around micro behaviors? Because addressing micro behaviors is really critical if you want to have a culture that is inclusive. It's like death by 1,000 paper cuts. What is a micro behavior? It's a small behavior that, if it's an aggression, has a big impact on the receiver. It could be ignoring someone, not platforming someone, talking about stereotypes, hair, way that people wear their hair, mood, racial stereotypes, cultural stereotypes. Small things that have a big impact, ignoring someone, nicknames, all these sorts of things. And I think that unless we start to address micro behaviors, it's very difficult to have a culture where people are respectful. Uniform policies, absolutely. Exclusionary, what does that mean? Yeah, exactly, Justine. I love that. Very interesting. It's also about us as individuals thinking, what's my tone? What's my mood? And is that leaking into how I behave with my colleagues? So inclusion is going to be more important now in this hybrid environment because people feeling anxious, worried. And what happens if there is a proximity bias in my workplace? A proximity bias, which means I favor people that work like me, that are nearer me. So say I'm a line manager who is desperate to get back into the office. Subconsciously, I'll probably be favoring people who want to get back in the office. How am I going to run meetings where people are phoning in from outside and 10 of us are around a table? Who's going to get the same treatment, fairness? Who's going to get a voice in that environment? So I really think there's a very, very strong argument for increasing people's awareness around what behaviors are needed to create inclusion in a hybrid work environment, because really of the pervasiveness of unconscious bias and the fact that unconscious bias affects all of us because we're human, and it affects us all the days, all times, in terms of being in social media, on our phones, the echo chamber that we're in that recreates our view of the world. So I buy something on Amazon, it'll tell me I like this. I look at these people on Instagram, and then suddenly, or you like to follow these people. The socialization element and influence in terms of what your parents told you about other people, where you grew up, your environment. These are all going to really impact on how I see my world, unless I'm able sometimes to take a pause and challenge the way I see my world. Experience. Say I have a poor experience with someone from a different social group, say I'm mugged or attacked. Is my brain going to be hardwired about anyone that looks like that person that attacked me in South London at 11 o'clock outside a pub? Yes, unless I can recognize the stereotype influence and take some space. Heuristics, shortcuts. We get 11 million pieces of information thrown at us at any one time. We can't cope with that, so we use shortcuts. We use patterns. Our brain is in automatic pilot 95% of the time. To override biases that are unhelpful, we need to slow down. We need to be self-aware enough to know where they're impacting. And that is why when we contextualize them within the workplace, we can do the work. So Justine, is unconscious bias training good or bad? I'd answer back, it depends how it's been done, who's doing it, and how toolkit orientated it is, how contextualized it is. What's happened, Justine, historically, is people have been led in a room, someone's turned the light on and gone, you're human, so you're biased. And it's created people being consciously incompetent, almost hiding behind it. I know I'm biased, so what? So I can't do anything about it. It's actually all about the application. If you build it in, Justine, to inclusive leadership and make it part of this, as we show here, it can be very useful and helpful. But it's all about the application, and it's never going to be the silver bullet. But it's been demonized. People demonize bias anyway because they go, oh, I'm not biased. I see it in everyone else, but it's not me, because we think inherently it's bad, so we don't own it. But also, Trump, not a fan. What a shame. British government has said, we're not doing any more bias training. It's a waste of money. It doesn't work. But actually, they haven't come up with an alternative. Bias has been kicked quite heavily since probably about 2017, when Harvard Business Review brought out a brilliant article about questioning the validity of training. I would say, and of course I'm biased because I'm a diversity consultant, that actually it should be badged as part of self-awareness raising. And if you give people the tools and you do the work properly so they can contextualize it, then it's part of the solution. Thank you, Justine. I'm just reading that. I love this framework and I think it's super helpful. We're talking here about good leadership. And when we get good leaders, then we can permeate that through a business. This is how we behave around here. This is why belonging is important. This is what we need to be on our A game for a hybrid environment, where some people are at home, some people aren't. Some people have thrived in some environments, some people are desperate to get back in. Younger people generally, may well want to get back in for learning, development, networking. I get that. I've been there. But other people, less so. So how can we educate the line to maximize inclusion in a hybrid environment? It's about bias. It's about recognizing I see things this way and there are other ways as well. How are people with disabilities and hidden disabilities included? We'll come back to that, Avril, at the end. It's a great question. But have a look at these traits and think, not what am I good at, but where do I need to work differently? Because this isn't just about your business or you dialing in as someone from HR. It's also about us as individuals and as humans. And you know what? We're all work in progress. None of us is perfect. Are we curious about other people? Do we know how to ask questions? How good are we at listening? How culturally intelligent are we? If I'm going to Russia and I'm from Israel, unless I'm culturally intelligent, I will not be able to motivate my team because there are different rules of engagement. How good are we at collaborating cross business with our clients, with our stakeholders? How courageous are we? Because talking about imperfections involves taking a risk, and that makes us vulnerable. So really, an inclusive leadership model for a hybrid world needs to be very, very much about servant leadership, about awareness, around listening, and around owning inclusion and taking responsibility. And before we close and take some questions, I just wanted to share a few ideas for inclusion and take ideas from you. But these are some behaviors that we could embrace in order to create more inclusion. And remember, my feeling is, and this is just me, inclusion is necessary as a starting point for a diverse organization. So it might be letting someone finish their sentence, actively seeking different opinions, calling out interruptions, listening to understand, giving eye contact when in this kind of environment, and unless there is a reason why I'm really uncomfortable giving eye contact, or maybe neurodiversity issue, that's fine. But I mean, this as a rule of thumb, it might be something to consider. It's not a hard and fast rule at all. But I just wanted to give some examples of inclusive behaviors because I think they're super helpful for today. But really, to summarize and to close the session before we take some questions, I fundamentally believe that inclusion and diversity are more important now for all of these reasons, because the world's such a different place than it was even 2 years ago, because inclusion and diversity are strategic imperatives, not nice to haves, because having a culture of psychological safety enables voices to be heard. And when we listen to people's voices and we understand how they are feeling and people feel they belong and are listened to, people do their best work. So it's not just the moral case behind this, it's the business case behind this. Pronouncing people's names, Abby, I hear you and I completely agree. And I think that I've heard too many managers talk about employees they've got on their team whose name is difficult for them to pronounce. So they put it in the too difficult box and decided on calling them a nickname. And what does that do? What messages does that send? How dehumanizing is that? So actually, Abby, maybe the biggest step forward for inclusion is people understanding more how to listen. Listen to understand rather than listen to respond. So I'm going to take slides away now and just find out if there are any questions, because that's all I've got in terms of slides. I know I've given you a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I hope it's been helpful and useful to addressing inclusion and diversity. And just very, very happy to take any questions.
Whilst we're getting the questions through, I'm just going to pop back on here. Thank you so much, Sasha. That has been amazing. There is one or two questions I'll come back to. I think there was one earlier on that I'll go back to and read out for you. But one thing, just while the questions are coming through, I do want to apologise. I did mess up your bio at the beginning, and there was a real critical part that I just think is really worth letting people know. We're really, really privileged to have you cover this slot. And I think one of the things that fascinated me and that you were in the global list. These are the global diversity list as being one of the top 10 global diversity consultants in the world, obviously. So thank you for giving the time up for this. So we are listening to a true expert, I must say. So use your time, use the next few minutes we've got and just get your questions through. So let's have a quick look. Is it easier for me to read these out to you, Sasha? So
yeah, if you have a go, yeah, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, okay, so there's one here from Terry. What would you say is the one thing a traditional law firm should do to show employees inclusion is real in the firm?
Okay, Terry, well, like, how do we unpack that? I've got 35 law firms on my book, so I hear you, Terry. I think authenticity at a leadership, at a partner level, is probably number one. But to get that group, that cohort, to get this, they need education themselves. So my start point would be education. And you know what, Terry, and this will ring true. What shifts law firms more than anything? Their clients, and knowing that other law firms are really doing this. But when I look at law firms that really punch above their weight, and for example, BCLP, I don't know if you've heard of them, Brian Cave, Leighton Paisner, they stand out, as well as Hogan Lovells, as amazing law firms around inclusion and diversity. They've made it their USP, and they've made it such that the leadership group understand what good looks like, and there's thorough accountability. So short answer, Terry, to a long question.
Excellent. We've got one from Avril Hitman. How are people with disabilities or hidden disabilities included in the workspace and hybrid workplace, not to make assumptions and bias?
Okay, really important question. Again, no short answer available, but what I do think, and I'd be interested, Avril, in your thoughts, are that maybe because we've all been working out of Zoom and virtually, arguably, does that, for some people with disabilities, it may have been easier to have a voice, to be part of conversations. Everyone's in the same size box. We're some, from a physical disability perspective, less possibly less trauma around travel and commuting and movement. So in some ways, I think tech has enabled us to become more inclusive. What I'm frightened of, Avril, is that gets lost as we go back into hybrid. And so around disability, we've seen amazing strides in terms of mental health and wellness being a priority for organizations. I think that the key thing for organizations is to keep that visibility up. I don't know, Avril, if you're aware of Valuable 500, but that's worth an organization looking at in terms of what more can organizations do to increase visibility of different disabilities within the workplace, so it doesn't get lost.
Brilliant, thank you. And we've got one from Justine here. Do you work with any police forces? And if so, any key learnings?
Justine, I'm a bit obsessed with line of duty. I have done some work with the army, not with police forces. I have been massively impressed, and actually, I don't know if this Sue Fish, I don't know, Justine, if Sue Fish's name means anything to you, but with the Sarah Everard case, Sue Fish, I think, was very senior at Nottingham Constabulary, brought in misogyny as a hate crime. It feels to me there are some real pioneers within the Met, including arguably Cressida Dick, but no, haven't done any work within the police force. So key learnings, I don't have any, but I could bore you, Justine, offline about key learnings from many other industries that I'm sure are applicable.
Excellent. And there was the one earlier on, again, I'm not sure there's a short answer to this, but it was somebody from the university, RBG University, asked, there's obviously a lot of nervousness about people saying the wrong thing, and kind of holds people back around terminology. And how do you help people get over that fear?
Yeah, the fear around language is huge, and there are some pointers. I mean, I'm not here to plug, but I'm just shamelessly going to say we do courses on inclusive language, and you know what? I'm building a new part of that last week, which was about inclusive listening, which is as important as the language. But the language question is really hard, because it's changing the whole time. It's often defined by the age group of the person in the room. It's defined by what part of the world I'm in. And it's a moving feast. So we've sort of designed principles around actually asking questions, self-ID, psychological safety, and listening, mirroring. For example, if, for example, Justine, talked, or my MD, I'll give a real life example before we close. My MD has got 3 hidden disabilities. And when she talks to me, she's very explicit about these are my disabilities. So I hear the word disability and I know there's a permission to use that word when we're talking together about it. She's given me those words. So often mirroring is a great way forward in trying to navigate language. But, finally, I think if you've got a positive intent to try and get this right, go for it, because we'll make mistakes. We're all human. I'm always making mistakes. My kids are pulling it up on me and I'm, this is my day job, right? But if we have a positive intent to try and we listen, then we're all going in the right direction.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And if anyone wants to get in touch with you, Sasha, if I ask, if you want to drop me an email, I'd be more than happy to share Sasha's email address and contact details if you need to follow
very open to that, and or join me on LinkedIn, because I'd like to continue some of these conversations. They're really interesting. But thank you everyone for listening.
Yeah, brilliant. No, thank you very much, Sasha, and thank you everybody for joining. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm sure you did. And enjoy the rest of your day. Nikki, I have to jump, but let's talk offline. Thanks so much for sharing your platform, Nikki. It's been fun. Yeah, brilliant. See you soon. Bye.